we need to do Bava Kamma properly. But I don't think we can do a whole lot of civil cases. I think we need a break and something a little bit different. Not that this isn't important, it's totally important, just a change of pace. But we're hitting a nice part of the Gemara at the moment because we're learning some things from Kedushin. So the Gemara suggests that Rav Asi's ruling is a matter of Tanaic dispute. Because if you remember what Rav Asi said, he was talking about the fact of it is his opinion is if craftsmen, plural, or a craftsman, singular, was given an item to fix or repair, and they damaged it, they have to replace it. But if they manufacture maybe a chest of drawers or a clothing closet or something like that from wood that is supplied in raw material by the person that wants the service, in that case, if it ends up being a bit of a hash job, then all he has to do is replace the wood, because apparently he sees that it affects ownership for the craftsman, that he's selling a cabinet, basically, and it's proceeds of the sale, and the wood has to be refunded, just like cash would have to be refunded on the deposit paid. So the raw material is seen as deposit paid, or the wood would have to be replaced. But there's a certain sort of concept that, according to Rav Asi, that it's considered not for labor, but for proceeds of the sales, whereas it differs from a case of fixing or repairing, where you're not really taking something from scratch, and therefore if you break it, you have to replace it because you've broken more than just a bit of wood that's been unfinished. You've broken an item that's almost rendered usable, had somebody else that was competent fixed it effectively. In terms of how much you have to pay, well, that would be a dispute. I would hardly think you'd have to pay for a new item, but what it would be worth at that point once fixed as a second-hand item. But as I say, I don't know halacha. But this, saying Rav Asi, this dispute that we have actually mimics a Tanaic dispute. Why? Because let us say that Rav Asi is ruling that a craftsman acquires an improvement to the utensil is a matter of dispute amongst the Tanoim. For we learned in a brisa, if a woman handed a piece of gold to a craftsman and said to him, fashion for me this anklet, earrings or rings out of this, and in return for your labor, I shall become betrothed to you. So in that particular case, once he makes them for her, she is betrothed. These are the words of Rabbi Meir, but the sages say she does not become betrothed until money reaches her hand. So let's just see what we're talking about here. So basically, the sages mean that Kedushin takes effect when the woman receives the finished piece of jewelry. Then obviously Rav Meir's statement that once he makes them for her, she is betrothed, at first glance it must be taken literally. In other words, the woman is betrothed at the very moment the craftsman completes his work on the gold, even before he actually receives it from him. Now, it can't be taken literally, guys, because just say she has an affair at that stage before there was actual Kedushin and an exchange of rings. She wouldn't get the death penalty, because we know that if the craftsman hasn't yet returned the finished jewelry to the woman, he's not given anything of value. I mean, even if you buy the ring for a woman, unless you put it on her finger under the kuppah, it's not considered a betrothal. So obviously Rabbi Meir considers Kedushin only to be valid at that stage. It goes without saying. And Tosfot's got an answer, and he says that having completed the work for her gratis, free of charge, I'm using an Afrikaans word, can't be considered as if he gave her anything at this point. Why? Because at the point where he busy manufactured it and he finished it, he can't demand payment until he returns the finished product. So therefore, he's got nothing to tell her. So, what does this actually mean? Is we need to just explain the words of the sages, because the sages say, listen, this is not a legitimate betrothal. So let's just see why. Because what's this money that the sages refer to when they say she does not become betrothed until money reaches her hand? So if you look at the statement, Ilema Otto Mamun, it says, it refers to money. What does it mean, money? The gold that he's working on. In other words, he's taken the gold that she gave him to the craftsman. And the sages mean that Kedushin takes effect when he returns a finished product of jewelry to her. It would leave us with a slight problem. Why? Because that would imply that Rabbi Meir holds that even the money need not be given to her for Kedushin to take effect. Meaning, upon first glance, it would take effect the minute he finished the product. But it can't be, because how would she become betrothed? There has to be a physical exchange. So, according to the sages, there's nothing given that would affect Kedushin. In other words, it can't be from the end of the manufacturing process. So it's obvious that when we're talking about money, the sages are saying that, and you are going to come to this conclusion, so there has to be other money into the deal in order for the betrothal to work. It's not foregoing of a debt. In other words, otherwise, she would owe him for his craftsmanship. So it must be that when Rabbi Meir says once he makes him for her, she is betrothed, Rabbi Meir is saying that once he finishes the jewelry and returns it to her, she becomes betrothed. And the sages who dispute the ruling maintain that jewelry itself doesn't affect Kedushin, and she becomes betrothed only if the craftsman gives her some other money of his own. Okay, so they say that because there's a different timeline, that might be the dispute. That might be it. So now that we've established the meaning of the respective rulings of the rabbis and Rabbi Meir, we're saying, well, what does this have to do with Rav Asi? I'll tell you how. Because the rabbis presumed that all the Tanaim of this brisa agree that a laborer's wage are earned from the beginning of the labor to the end of it. So what do we mean by that? Is that basically a laborer doesn't earn his wages in one lump sum when he finishes the task. What happens is he earns them in increments. You can think of it like project management on an engineering job. That there's phase 1, there's phase 2, there's phase 3. And we used to do this in the signage industries. We were worried sometimes clients wouldn't pay. So they'd pay a little bit of a deposit. And if it was a big job, we often heard of cases where at the end, a person would work on it and you can't find the right person to pay you when you need it. So what would happen is we would basically invoice and have the client sign off on each phase of the product and the services and the labor and the manufactured goods and everything upon each completed phase of the project, right? So in that particular case, you would earn for each part of the project. So that's what the Gemara is saying here. You're earning it in increments according to each pruta's worth of work. But the employer in this case becomes indebted to pay him for that segment of his labor after he's done each piece of work. But it doesn't work like that in reality. In other words, it's duly noted, but the account is not payable until the laborer finishes his work. So as long as the laborer is still involved in the job, the wages he's earned are comparable to a debt that is due, for example, after 30 days. In other words, the money is owed immediately, but not collectible until later. Why? To ensure that at the end of the day, you don't have 80% of a project complete and the guy goes AWOL. Or I didn't trust human beings, so I didn't work like that. In other words, after each phase, I wouldn't allow it to accumulate to the end. South Africa was always South Africa. So, what's that effect on Rav Asi? Well, it's very simple. If all the rabbis agree that one betroths a woman with a loan, she's not betrothed. In other words, what he's saying, not Rabbi Meir, but what the rabbis are saying is that the different methods of effecting Kedushin. And if you look at the Gemara Kedushin 2a, one of the methods is through money. So what happens is the man gives money, a pruta. Pruta is low value, not that she's not worth something, but because even the poor are entitled to get married, or an object of monetary value. In other words, it can either be a pruta of money, a certain value, or an object of value representational of that financial worth. And the man says to her, you are hereby betrothed to me with this money. And then the rabbis of the academy were basically of the opinion that all agree that instead of giving the woman money, if the man betroths the woman by forgiving a loan that she owed him, Kedushin does not take effect. In other words, foregoing a loan does not affect Kedushin, even though it's tantamount to the same if you think of it in terms of a logical concept. Rabbi Meir says it's sufficient, okay? Because he's saying that basically if the piece of jewelry that he fashioned for her from raw gold is worth 10,000 rand, then what would happen is it's a matter of semantics. She would pay him 10,000 rand, would go out and buy a ring for 10,000 rand, and then give her the ring, and therefore said to you are mine, will you marry me, etc., etc., and it would exchange hands. So according to Rabbi Meir, it's exactly the same thing. In other words, forgiving a debt, she already agreed in the beginning of the process she'd marry him. He agreed he'd marry her, and in lieu of payment, it's the same as him going through the semantics of buying an article. And the rabbis say it doesn't work like that. It's not about semantics. It's about actually acquiring her, not forgiving a debt. They're two separate issues. Do you understand where they disagree, guys? So just on a okay. So what it means is it not so that the Tanaim dispute whether craftsman acquires the improvement to the utensil? Okay, what do you mean? Because the dispute would be that Rabbi Meir holds that a craftsman acquires the improvement to a utensil, and the rabbis hold that a craftsman does not acquire the improvement to a utensil. So what are we basically saying here is that, well, firstly, the reason Kedushin doesn't take effect is that the obligation to repay a loan is not to return the actual money borrowed. Now, this is very clever, but rather to compensate the lender with equivalent funds at a later date. So as such, guys, when a woman borrows money from a man, she becomes the legal owner of that particular money. It's actual physical money, and she can spend it as she sees fit. So when the man subsequently forgives her the loan for the sake of Kedushin, he's only releasing her from her obligation to repay the loan. He's not giving her any money that she doesn't already own. She owns it. He gave it to her. That's hers now. She can pay it back with other money at a later juncture. So according to Kedushin 6b, that's why the Kedushin is ineffective. You see, it's quite clever. Okay, so guys, this is based on the two or four. How do I say this in a simple way? There's two aforementioned assumptions. Number one, a laborer earns a wage in 1 pruta increments. In other words, every time you do a particular task or part of the project phasing, you should get paid at that stage. Although you paid at the end because we want to see that the project, in fact, was successful. It's calculated and owed at a later stage. So that's almost that's one particular factor. And the other one is you can't betray the woman by forgiving a loan. So now, obviously, it follows that if you were to treat a contractor's fee as a wage, you can't betray the woman by waiving his fee for fashioning her gold into jewelry. Why? Because as he completes each pruta's worth of work, she becomes indebted to pay for that segment of the labor. Okay? So, which means it doesn't accumulate necessarily enough to buy her hand in marriage. But even let's say it does, and he's the best in the business, when he performs the act of Kedushin, you guys, you've got to notice that that's when he finishes the labor for her and returns the piece of jewelry to her. So in other words, she was already indebted to him at an earlier time. In other words, each time he did a bit of labor, that's the pruta's worth of work that was completed. In other words, it's like a loan. So in other words, he's betrothing her by forgiving her debt. And the problem that the rabbis have with that is that she's already is given the money on her loan. So it's her money now. So whatever she pays him back is of a separate account. It's not as if he gave it to her in order to get her hand in marriage. He gave it to her, and it's different currency to which she has to pay back. And since she's paying back at a later juncture with different currency, that's not an active acquisition at all. Okay. But perforce Rabbi Meir, who says that the craftsman does effect Kedushin by returning the finished jewelry to her, he holds something different. He holds that a craftsman acquires the improvement to the finished jewelry, meaning he's actually not a laborer, guys. He sees it, Rabbi Meir sees it like Rav Asi sees it. That Rabbi Meir came before Rav Asi. So Rabbi Asi sees it like Rav Meir, that he's got his own business. And what's happened here is it's almost proceeds to a sale. So you gave her a finished piece of jewelry. He's not a laborer. And therefore it's not about forgiving a debt. Does that make sense? Okay. So, in other words, when the craftsman finishes the jewelry for the woman, he betroths her by giving her his share in the jewelry, meaning it was finished. He's selling her a piece of jewelry. It's worth 10,000 rand, and he's giving her that 10,000 rand as a betrothal gift. And he gives her his share of the jewelry which he acquires. Now, you can only say he acquires that share of the jewelry if he's not seen as a laborer paid for services, but rather as a business owner that is entitled to sell that on any market. It just so happens that she's the buyer and for her hand in marriage. So according to Rabbi Meir, the betrothal is valid. The sages rule that Kedushin is invalid. Why? Because they hold a craftsman doesn't acquire improvement to the jewelry. He's a laborer. So his fee is worth no more than a wage. And he earns as he completes each putter's worth of work, which means when he betroths her by returning the finished jewelry to her and waiving his fee, he's betrothing her with a loan. And the Kedushin is invalid because you can only effect Kedushin by giving her other money. Because it's her money that she's borrowing and she pays him back at a later stage. They are two very, very separate issues according to the rabbis. It's not semantics. Okay. So so this is what the Gemara is proposing, is that maybe the dispute would be that Rabbi Meir holds that a craftsman acquires the improvement to the utensil, and the rabbis hold that craftsmen do not acquire the improvement of the utensil. So that's what we've discussed. But the Gemara says no. We could be talking about something a little different here, and this is not necessarily a proof that Rabbi Meir agrees with Rav Asi. The rabbis certainly don't. So this doesn't mimic a previous disagreement. Why? Because the rabbis of our Mishnah, or the Tanna Kamma of our Mishnah, is saying that basically, whether you get an item from scratch, like a piece of wood, and you turn it into a cabinet and you ruin it, you have to pay for it, not just the wood. And the same is true with fixing and repairing. It's only Rav Asi that says that if you get a raw material, you give back the deposit in the wood, but you don't have to pay for the damage because you've acquired it and reselling the proceeds to a sale, you only have to return the deposit. Okay, so if you want to put it in a slightly different way, there's an alternative to night dispute. Could be, in fact, that all agree that a craftsman does, in fact, does not acquire the improvement to the utensil. In other words, it could be even that Rabbi Meir holds, unlike Rav Asi, that no craftsman acquires the improvement to the utensil, and that the craftsman fee is actually seen the same as a day laborer's wage, although he's paid in increments and it's a good salary. But this pricer is disputing a much more specific point, and that's the financial aspect, that whether a laborer's wages are earned from the beginning of his labor to the end of it. Now, Rabbi Meir holds that a laborer's wages are earned only in the end, when he completes his work and returns the finished product. Okay? In other words, according to Rabbi Meir, a laborer doesn't earn his wage in one pruta increments, but only in one lump sum when he completes his task, and that a craftsman's task is not complete until he returns the finished product. Now, accordingly, the proof is from Kedushin 48a, when the craftsman actually returns the finished jewelry to the woman and betroths her by waiving his fee, he's not betrothing her, guys, by forgiving her debt. Listen carefully, because there's no debt that exists. There's no amount of debt that's been accruing by one increment of prutas owing up over a period of 30 days or whenever the project is finished. It's only due when he hands it to her. So since it's not about a loan and forgiving a debt, he's actually betrothing her through the benefit he gives her. In other words, he's giving her the service he performed for the sake of Kedushin in one go. It's not forgiving of a debt. Do you see how Rabbi Meir sees it? Guys?
Yeah.
Yes? Now,
Yes.
okay, it's different. The rabbis see it differently, right?
Mm.
Because the rabbis hold that a laborer's wages are earned from the beginning of his labor to the end of it. Now you've got a bit of a problem. Because what it means is that when he returns the finished jewelry and betroths her by foregoing his fee, he's actually betrothing her with a loan. And the debt that has accumulated previously in one pruta increments, and Kedushin is ineffective because all he did is forgive a loan. You can't acquire somebody through forgiving of a debt. They owe you the money. Although it would seem the same, what would be better is that she pays the money back to him, and once he's got the money, he then takes whatever money he has or some new money and betroths her with that, because that now has been affected as his ownership, and he's acquiring her with what is his. Okay, so here the Tanaim are disputing the law with respect to one who betroths the loan. So that could be that Rabbi Meir holds that if one betroths a woman with a loan, she's betrothed. Okay? And the rabbis hold that if one betroths a woman with a loan, she's not betrothed. Why? Because the indebtedness would seem to mimic that. But there is a certain problem, because when the Gemara says that, it's not that Rabbi Meir sees it even as a loan. It's that it's not a loan. It's that he's only entitled to be paid as though he was selling a service at the point where he delivers the jewelry. So therefore, it's not forgiving of a debt. So even though the Gemara says, and here the Tanaim are disputing the law with respect to one who betroths with a loan, the dispute would be that Rabbi Meir holds that if one betroths a woman with a loan, she is betrothed, and the rabbis hold that if one betroths a woman with a loan, she is not betrothed. It's not quite like that. Do you get it, guys? So the Gemara even suggests a slightly different alternative interpretation of the brisa. What is it? So Rava says it might be that all agree that a laborer's wage are earned from the beginning of his labor to the end of it. In other words, and when he returns the finished jewelry to her for the sake of Kedushin, he's betrothing her with a loan. In other words, they're saying, say everybody agrees to that. Okay? And the Gemara says, let's just say that all agree that if one betroths a woman with a loan, she is not betrothed. And all agree that a craftsman does not acquire the improvement to a utensil. So I'm going to repeat this again. This is only Rava's opinion. And Rava says it might be that all agree that a laborer's wages are earned from the beginning of his labor to the end of it, and that all agree that if one betroths with a loan, she is not betrothed, and that all agree that a craftsman does not acquire the improvement of utensil. So what does that actually mean, bottom line? Is that the fee paid to him doesn't constitute a proceeds of a sale. But according to Rava, everybody agrees that it's a laborer's wage. And it accrues in one pruta increments. So when he returns the finished jewelry to her, he is in effect trying to betroth her with a loan, but it's ineffective. Okay? Now there's a concept called nofech. Well, it's not a concept. It's a concept of that he has to add something to the party. Let me tell you what it is. So Rabbi Meir agrees that merely finishing the jewelry and returning it to the woman would not affect Kedushin. This is according to Rava. And Rava is saying that we're dealing with here a separate case, that when he finishes, for example, the golden ring, what the craftsman added for her was a gemstone of his own to the ornament that he was making. Okay, now Rabbi Meir holds that when one betroths a woman by giving her a loan and a pruta, her mind is on the pruta, not on the loan, and therefore the Kedushin is valid. And the rabbis hold that when he betroths a woman by giving her a loan and a pruta, the mind is on the loan. In other words, she intends to become betrothed with the loan, and Kedushin is therefore invalid and therefore ineffective. So let me just explain to you what I'm saying here. There is in Shemot chapter 28, verse 18, there's a nofech, which is a type of gemstone. They call it in Greek smaragdos, which is an emerald. It's actually an emerald. Okay, so what that was, it's the equivalent to a diamond. So he made a ring for her, which she paid for, and he decided to put a emerald and say, will you be mine? So according to that, he's added something to the picture that wasn't there before. In other words, he cannot affect Kedushin with the ring because he's seen as a laborer according to Rabbah, both according to Rabbi Meir and the rabbis, and therefore it's not proceeds to the sale. So he can't affect the Kedushin with the ring. What he did is add a gemstone on, okay, a wedding ring, but the gold band is hers. And he set it for her. He put a setting for her. Now, Rabbi Meir said it's an effective Kedushin there because he added in his own gemstone. And the rabbis acknowledge, okay, according to Rabbi, he put on his own gemstone. So why do the rabbis say it's ineffective? Very simple. The rabbis are saying, and I thought Kevin's going to ask a question here, and I'll tell you what Kevin's question is because I know what it's going to be. So Rabbi Meir is saying that her intent is on that extra diamond ring she got, for example, on the gold band that he made for her. Now, she bought the gold band for herself, and he said, listen, I'm putting on a diamond ring for you if you'll have me as your husband. And she says, yes. And Rabbi Meir said she's excited, and she basically holds that her mind on the ring and accepts marriage, and it's accepted based on not the ring, but the diamond that's added to the ring. Okay? And the rabbis say no, her mind is actually on the wedding, her mind is on the gold ring, and it's not on the gemstone that he's trying to propose with her, and therefore it doesn't affect Kedushin. So Kevin would ask the question now, because he's famous for asking this, which is a very good question, is how do we know what this woman's thinking? Because no man knows what a woman's really thinking. Ask Arthur's been married to his wife for 20 odd years. You don't know?
Well, that's why some of us don't ask that question, because we just know it's like pointers.
You have to understand one thing, okay? When you learn your wife's rules, as soon as you think you have, she goes and changes them, and you've got to restart again. It's never ending. So you never know what they think.
Exactly. So we're saying, how do the rabbis know what your wife to be would be thinking? So there's a practical answer to Kevin's would-be brilliant question, because I know Kevin would ask it if he's not on the bus. Because he's asked that question before. It's a famous Rabbi Meir thought question. Okay. So the answer is as follows. Rabbi Meir is saying, as long as there is potential for her to focus her mind on the acquisition of the asset given to her in lieu of marriage, then that suffices because there's a mechanism to do it. We can't read her mind, but we know that he's chosen a legal mechanism to acquire her. And if she accepts the wedding band, if she accepts the gold ring with the gemstone on top, then by her accepting it, she knows what the situation is. In other words, it's a mechanism. Otherwise, she'd say to listen, I'm muting you. Sorry, it's just overpowering. So what we are saying is here, Rabbi Meir is saying, look, he comes to her with her gold ring, and he puts a diamond on top or an emerald. Now, the minute she accepts that, she's accepted his hand in marriage because ain't nothing coming for free, nothing. So otherwise, she'd hand it back to him and say to him, take off the emerald and give me my ring back. I don't accept your hand in marriage. So according to Rabbi Meir, there's a mechanism to allow for Kedushin. According to the rabbis who say that how do we know her mind's on the emerald and not on the debt that's due by her to pay? Do you get what I'm saying? In other words, which portion is a concentration on? So they're saying because there's a chance that it could be on the loan aspect, it doesn't affect Kedushin. In other words, the rabbi's opinions are you've given too many variables. If you really want to marry her, take the loan aspect out of it completely. And once you've sorted out the debt and she's paid you, fine. Then she's paid you, she's done. And then get her something separate, and if she accepts it, it's clean. Rabbi Meir says it is clean anyway. Why? Because if she doesn't want it, she can kind of like hand it back to you. She's accepted upon herself because there's a proper mechanism. Right. So let me just continue. I've got a few minutes left. I've got 8 minutes, and I've got to get through this very, very quickly. Okay. So the Gemara continues, and according to this interpretation, Rabbi Meir and the sages, according to Rava, argued the same point disputed by the other Tanoim, which was taught in a brisa. If a craftsman says to a woman, become betrothed to me with the wages that you owe me for work that I have already done for you, she is not betrothed. If, however, he did not yet perform any work for her and stated in advance, guys, become betrothed to me with the wages that you will owe me for the work that I will do for you. Then once he completed the work on an item and returns it to her, she indeed becomes betrothed. Okay? So we want to know the rabbinic opinion on that. In other words, an upfront discussion beforehand. Does she consent? Rav Nassan says, even in the second case where the man said to her, become betrothed to me with the wages that you will owe me for that work that I will do for you, she's not betrothed. And certainly she's not betrothed in the first case when he says to become betrothed to me with the wages that you owe me for the work that I've already done for you. So there's no argument in terms of if you've done work for a woman and the oak behind, the craftsman behind the jewelry store is saying, listen, babe, I can forgive the debt. You want to marry me? Okay, that's not going to fly according to any opinion. But if it's said before, that's a question. But Rav Nassan says, listen, even if she comes to the jewelry store and he says to her, listen, babe, you're really hot. I like you. You seem a nice person. I don't know you that well yet. I want to marry you. I'll do all this work for you, but on condition that I do this in lieu of acquiring you as a wife. Is that a question? So Rav Nassan said, no, still doesn't graft. It's not allowed. It's not an active betrothal. So, Rav Yehuda Hanasi, now you must know who Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi is. He redacted the Mishnah. He's big. And he said, in truth, they said. Now, whenever the Gemara uses the term in truth, they said, it means that that's the halacha. If it says be'emet amru, it introduces a statement that is accepted as halacha. Guys, it's in Gemara Sukkot 38a, it's in Bava Kamma 60a, it's in Nazir 54b. I can give you a myriad of examples of where the Mishnah uses that term. In truth, they said it's halacha. So Rav Yehuda Hanasi says, whether the man said to betroth me to you with the wages that you owe me for the work that I've already done for you. In other words, he said it after the fact, or he said before the fact, become betrothed to me with wages that you will owe me for work that I will do for you. She's not betrothed. If, however, he added a gemstone of his own to the item he was working on for the woman, then she is betrothed. So that is the halacha. Okay, quickly, I've got 5 minutes. So that is the halacha, that if he adds that gemstone, he is married. That's according to Rav Yehuda Hanasi. So that seems to disagree with the rabbis and agree with Rabbi Meir. So the Gemara explains the basis of the dispute in the Brisa. So in doing so, it shows how the views of the latter two Tanoim, Rav Nassan and Rav Yehuda Hanasi, reflect the opinions of Rabbi Meir and the sages, as explained by Rabbi. What's the point of the dispute between the Tana Kamma and Rav Nassan? The point of the dispute between them is whether a laborer's wages are earned gradually as he works in one pruta increments, or only at the end when he completes the work and returns the finished product. And the point of dispute between Rav Nassan and Rav Yehuda Hanasi is whether betrothal with a loan and a pruta is valid. In other words, both Rav Nassan and Rav Yehuda Hanasi agree that a laborer's wages, guys, are earned from the beginning to the end. So in the case of the Brisa, the craftsman's wages are a loan with which he cannot betroth the woman. So Rav Yehuda Hanasi maintains that if he gives her a gemstone in addition to forgiving this loan, in addition, guys, to forgiving the loan, Kedushin will be valid. Because we can assume that the woman intended to become betrothed with the gemstone, but not with the loan portion, but he must forgive both. Rav Nassan disagrees, for he contends that a woman will intend to become betrothed with the loan aspect if that is forgiven, because that's an element of doubt at which it's not effective, even if a gemstone is added and the Kedushin is not affected. So, in both cases, you can't give a gemstone in effect and in effect expect the ring to be paid back, because women always like the first date paid. So although they said we can split the bill, it's a trap. Don't you ever fall for it, any of you. It's some woke thing that they test you with, and then they want traditional values, but they've got a body count of 19. But they say they're traditional women when they want the man to pay, but they don't act like traditional women. They act a bit forward. So the bottom line is here, guys, is that you have to forgive both the loan and a gemstone. And in that particular case, it would be considered, according to Rav Yehuda Nasi, that it's a legitimate marriage, because he agrees with Rabbi Meir that's what her focus is on. And the Rav Nassan agrees with the rabbis that says as long as there's an element of doubt that there's a loan component to it that was forgiven, even if he adds on the gemstone on top of it, it's not a valid marriage. All right, guys, we've got 2 minutes left. Kevin, teach us for 2 minutes. Talk to us.
Good timing. I just hopped off the bus, as you can see. Okay, so today, can you hear me? It's not. I hope it's not
Yes,
too
we
noisy.
can. Talk. We've got 2 minutes.
Okay, good. So I just need to think of something. Okay, so it was Parshat Vayakel, the end of Parshat Shmot, and you mentioned Shmot earlier, where all the components and the everything that comprises the Mishkan, all the materials, etc., discussed in great detail. And what I think is if it's discussed in great detail, just thought of this now. Even though something might seem so insignificant, like all the different colors of the stones for the ephod, the breastplate, all this, and maybe they needed a strand of this type of material, argamon and the shani, the red crimson. It's like, who cares? But it obviously means everything's important, and especially if it's mentioned in the Torah, and this has been said before. Nothing is insignificant, and with actions and small mitzvahs, everything counts. And as the famous song by Depeche Mode, Lahavdil, goes, everything counts in small amounts. I don't know if you remember that song. So everything counts, even in small amounts, and nothing's insignificant. And this is the thing with mitzvahs. Even a mitzvah, you put a rand in a tzedakah box, it all counts. And to do that 100 times gets you into the habit of giving tzedakah.